Consider this moral dilemma. A pharmaceutical company can save thousands of lives by releasing a life-saving drug, but only by breaking a patent that would bankrupt them. Most ethical systems would weigh consequences, lives saved versus economic harm. But there exists a moral test so rigorous, so uncompromising, that it cuts through such calculations to reveal the true nature of right and wrong. After decades developing the critical system here in Königsberg, examining the very foundations of human reason itself, I discovered that genuine morality cannot depend on outcomes, emotions, or cultural preferences. These shifting grounds provide no stable foundation for universal moral law. Instead, through pure practical reason, we can establish an absolute moral test, the categorical imperative, that reveals whether any action possesses genuine moral worth. This is not merely abstract philosophy. Every day, you face moral choices that demand rational evaluation. Should you keep a promise when breaking it would produce better results? Is it acceptable to lie to protect someone's feelings? Can you justify using others to achieve noble goals? The categorical imperative provides the only reliable method for answering such questions, because it tests the rational structure of your moral reasoning itself, not its contingent consequences. Today, I invite you to discover why this moral test stands alone as the foundation of genuine ethics, transcending cultural relativism and utilitarian calculation to reveal universal principles that honor human dignity. Chapter 1: The Failure of Consequence-Based Ethics. Throughout history, humans have attempted to ground morality in various foundations: divine commands, natural inclinations, social contracts, or utilitarian calculations of pleasure and pain. Yet each of these approaches contains a fatal flaw that undermines its claim to universal validity. Consider utilitarian ethics, which judges actions by their consequences. When facing the pharmaceutical dilemma I mentioned, utilitarianism would seemingly require violating the patent if more lives are saved than harmed. But this approach reduces human beings to mere units in a calculation, treating their rights and dignity as negotiable based on aggregate outcomes. More fundamentally, it makes morality hostage to empirical predictions about consequences that we can never know with certainty. During my critical period, examining the limits and possibilities of human reason, I recognized that any ethical system based on consequences faces an insurmountable epistemological problem. We cannot possess complete knowledge of all effects flowing from our actions. The pharmaceutical company cannot know whether patent violation might discourage future research, ultimately costing more lives. Utilitarian calculation requires omniscience we do not possess. Religious command theories suffer equally decisive objections. If moral laws depend on divine will, then morality becomes arbitrary. God could command cruelty and it would become right. If God commands what is already right independently, then divine will is not the source of morality. Either way, religious foundations fail to establish objective moral law. Natural law approaches ground ethics in human nature or natural inclinations. But observation reveals that natural inclinations vary dramatically across individuals and cultures. Some humans naturally tend toward compassion, others toward aggression. Natural inclinations themselves require moral evaluation. We cannot derive aught from is without prior moral principles. Social contract theories make morality dependent on agreements among rational agents. Yet such agreements reflect historical accidents, power imbalances, and cultural limitations. What societies have agreed upon include slavery, oppression of women, and countless other practices we now recognize as wrong. If morality depends on social agreement, it cannot provide standards for critiquing existing social arrangements. Each of these approaches seeks to ground morality in something empirical: consequences, divine commands, natural facts, social agreements. But empirical foundations necessarily introduce contingency into moral law. What is contingent cannot be universal and necessary, which genuine moral law must be. The categorical imperative alone provides rational foundation for universal moral law because it tests the logical structure of moral reasoning itself, independent of contingent facts about consequences, nature, or social agreement. Chapter 2: The Logical Structure of Universal Moral Law. The categorical imperative emerges not from empirical observation but from analysis of what rational moral agency requires. When you act morally, you implicitly claim that your action is right not merely for you, but for anyone in relevantly similar circumstances. This universalizability lies at the heart of moral reasoning itself. Consider the first formulation: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This is not an arbitrary rule imposed from outside, but the logical structure that moral reasoning must possess to count as moral rather than merely prudential or preferential. When contemplating any action, you must identify the maxim or principle underlying your choice. If considering breaking a promise to avoid embarrassment, your maxim might be, break promises when keeping them causes personal discomfort. The universalizability test then asks, could you rationally will this maxim to become a universal law governing all rational agents? Here the logical contradiction emerges. If everyone broke promises whenever keeping them caused discomfort, the institution of promising would collapse. Promises depend on general expectation of fulfillment. Without this expectation, words like, I promise, become meaningless. You cannot rationally will the universal adoption of a maxim that undermines the very practice that makes your action possible. This reveals the categorical imperative's genius. It is not consequentialist, it does not forbid promise breaking because of bad results, but because the maxim contains logical self-contradiction when universalized. You cannot coherently will universal adoption of principles that defeat themselves. The pharmaceutical company facing patent violation must ask, could we rationally will that all companies violate patents when they judge this necessary to save lives? Such universal law would destroy the patent system entirely, eliminating incentives for pharmaceutical research and ultimately preventing development of life-saving drugs. The maxim defeats its own purpose when universalized. This logical structure explains why the categorical imperative generates absolute duties rather than guidelines for weighing consequences. Logical contradictions are not matters of degree. A principle either contains contradiction when universalized or it does not. If it does, the action is forbidden regardless of apparent beneficial consequences. The universalizability test also explains moral equality. When you apply categorical imperative, you must abstract from all features that distinguish you from others, your talents, social position, personal desires. The test asks what you could will as a rational agent among other rational agents, not as this particular person with these specific advantages. This rational procedure generates moral law that binds all rational beings equally, creating the foundation for human dignity and rights that no utilitarian calculation can provide. Chapter 3: Human Dignity and the Formula of Humanity. The second formulation of the categorical imperative reveals the substantive content behind its formal structure: act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This formulation illuminates why certain actions are wrong regardless of their consequences. They violate the fundamental dignity that rational nature possesses. What distinguishes rational beings from everything else in nature? Animals, plants, and inanimate objects have value only relative to the purposes they serve. A hammer has value because it drives nails, food has value because it nourishes, even beloved pets have value because they bring joy or companionship. But rational beings possess absolute, unconditional value, dignity, that exists independently of any purpose they might serve. This dignity stems from autonomy, the capacity for rational self-determination according to moral law. Unlike everything else in nature, which follows natural laws mechanically, rational beings can act according to laws they give themselves through reason. This autonomy makes each rational being literally irreplaceable and priceless. Consider how this applies to contemporary moral dilemmas. In medical research, is it permissible to conduct dangerous experiments on unwilling subjects if the knowledge gained could save thousands? The formula of humanity provides a clear answer. Using unwilling subjects treats them merely as means to medical advancement, violating their dignity as autonomous rational agents capable of making their own decisions about their bodies and lives. The pharmaceutical company cannot simply calculate whether patent violation produces net benefit. They must ask whether their action treats patent holders merely as obstacles to overcome rather than as rational agents whose rights deserve respect. The patent system protects not just economic interests but the autonomy of inventors to control the fruits of their rational labor. This principle transforms how we understand justice and rights. Rights are not privileges granted by society or calculations of utility, but recognition of the inherent dignity that rational nature possesses. When someone violates your rights, they wrong you not because society disapproves or because bad consequences follow, but because they fail to respect your dignity as a rational being. The formula of humanity also generates positive duties. If rational nature has absolute value, you must promote conditions that allow rational beings to exercise their autonomy. This includes duties to develop your own rational capacities and to help others overcome obstacles to their rational self-determination. Notice how this differs from utilitarian concern for welfare. Utilitarianism aims to maximize pleasure or preference satisfaction, treating rational agents as sophisticated pleasure-seeking machines. The formula of humanity demands respect for persons as rational legislators in the kingdom of ends, regardless of their particular preferences or contribution to aggregate welfare. This insight reveals why certain actions feel deeply wrong even when they produce good consequences. Using people merely as means violates something fundamental about their nature as rational beings. It denies their capacity for moral autonomy that elevates them above the natural world of cause and effect. Chapter 4: Goodwill and the Moral Worth of Actions. Understanding why the categorical imperative provides the only true moral test requires grasping the distinction between actions performed according to duty and actions performed from duty. This distinction reveals that genuine moral worth lies not in external conformity to moral rules, but in the goodwill that motivates action from respect for moral law itself. Consider a shopkeeper who gives correct change to customers. If he does so only because honesty brings repeat business and good reputation, his action accords with duty but lacks moral worth. The same external behavior, giving correct change, could spring from moral motivation or merely prudential calculation. Moral worth resides in the motive, not the outcome. The goodwill represents the only unconditionally good thing in existence. Talents like intelligence can be used for evil, goods like wealth can corrupt, even traditionally virtuous traits like courage can serve immoral purposes. But goodwill, the commitment to act from respect for moral law, remains good regardless of its effects or the circumstances in which it operates. This analysis reveals why consequence-based ethics misses the essence of morality. During my investigations into practical reason, I discovered that what makes an action genuinely moral is the agent's commitment to acting from duty rather than inclination, regardless of whether this produces better or worse outcomes than alternative motives would generate. Return to our pharmaceutical example. Imagine two companies facing the same patent dilemma. Company A violates the patent because executives calculate this will maximize overall welfare. Company B respects the patent because they recognize that universal patent violation would undermine the rational foundation of intellectual property rights, even though they believe violation might save more lives in this instance. Company A acts according to what it takes to be moral requirements but from utilitarian motivation. Company B acts from respect for moral law itself, from duty rather than calculation of consequences. Only Company B's action possesses genuine moral worth, regardless of which decision produces better outcomes. This insight explains why moral education cannot simply teach people to follow rules or maximize good consequences. True moral development requires cultivating goodwill, the disposition to act from respect for moral law because it is moral law, not because obedience produces rewards or punishments. The categorical imperative serves as the only reliable test of moral worth because it evaluates the rational structure of our moral motivation itself. When you apply the universalizability test, you ask whether you could will your maxim as law for all rational beings. This process abstracts from all considerations except respect for the rational nature that we share. Acting from goodwill means choosing actions you could endorse as universal law and not because you want others to act similarly for your benefit, but because rational consistency demands universal validity of moral principles. You honor the capacity for rational self-legislation that distinguishes moral agents from everything else in nature. This demanding standard explains why truly moral action is rare and worthy of respect. Most human action springs from natural inclinations, social pressure, habit, or calculated self-interest. Action from goodwill requires overcoming these natural motivations to act from respect for rational moral law. The categorical imperative thus serves not merely as decision procedure but as test of moral character itself. Chapter 5: Freedom, Determinism, and Moral Responsibility. The categorical imperative's claim to universal validity confronts a fundamental challenge. If humans are part of the natural world governed by causal laws, how can we possess the freedom necessary for moral responsibility? This antinomy between freedom and determinism threatened to undermine the entire moral project until critical philosophy revealed how both can be true simultaneously. Consider yourself making a moral decision. As a physical being, your brain states follow natural laws just like any other physical system. Neuroscience increasingly demonstrates how thoughts and decisions correlate with measurable brain activity. If your choices result inevitably from prior causes stretching back to conditions existing before your birth, how can you be held morally responsible for actions you could not ultimately control? This challenge goes beyond academic philosophy. It strikes at the foundation of moral evaluation itself. Courts, personal relationships, and self-assessment all presuppose that people can choose differently and bear responsibility for their choices. Yet scientific understanding seems to reveal human behavior as another natural phenomenon governed by deterministic laws. The resolution emerges through recognizing that we exist simultaneously in two worlds: the sensible world of empirical experience and the intelligible world of rational principles. As phenomena appearing in space and time, our actions indeed follow natural laws and can be predicted and explained through scientific investigation. But as noumena, things as they are independently of our ways of experiencing them, we possess rational nature that can act according to self-imposed moral laws. This transcendental distinction does not mean we have souls separate from bodies, but rather that the same rational beings who appear in the phenomenal world as causally determined also possess rational capacities that operate according to logical rather than merely causal principles. When you reason mathematically, discover logical contradictions, or apply moral principles, you exercise capacities that follow rational necessity rather than mechanical causation. Moral freedom does not require exemption from natural law but rather the capacity to determine action according to rationally chosen principles. The categorical imperative makes this freedom actual by providing rational law that practical reason can impose upon itself independently of natural inclinations or external coercion. When you choose to keep a promise despite strong temptation to break it, you exercise transcendental freedom, not by violating natural causation, but by determining action according to universally valid moral principles rather than merely responding to strongest desires. Your choice expresses rational autonomy that elevates human action above mechanical natural processes. This analysis reveals why moral responsibility requires categorical rather than hypothetical imperatives. If moral law took the form, "If you want to be happy, act honestly," it would reduce to prudential advice about means to given ends. Moral obligation must be categorical, binding regardless of your particular desires or goals, to ground genuine responsibility. The pharmaceutical company executives face this freedom directly. As natural beings influenced by economic pressures, legal constraints, and social expectations, their decision appears determined by causal factors. But as rational agents capable of applying universal moral principles, they possess freedom to act from duty rather than mere inclination or calculation. This transcendental freedom makes moral evaluation possible while preserving scientific understanding of human behavior. We can investigate empirical psychology while maintaining that rational beings possess dignity grounded in their capacity for moral autonomy. Chapter 6: The Kingdom of Ends and Moral Community. The third formulation of the categorical imperative reveals the social dimension of moral law. Act as if you were through your maxims a legislating member in a universal kingdom of ends. This formulation synthesizes the formal universalizability requirement with substantive respect for human dignity, presenting moral life as participation in an ideal community where all rational beings cooperate in creating moral law. Imagine a society where every member possesses both the authority to propose moral laws and the obligation to live under laws they could rationally endorse for all members. No one enjoys special privileges or exemptions. Every person participates equally in moral legislation while remaining subject to the laws they help create. This kingdom of ends represents the ideal that moral action should realize in the actual world. This vision transforms how we understand moral relationships. Rather than seeing ethics as external constraints imposed by society, religion, or nature, the kingdom of ends reveals morality as collaborative self-legislation among equal rational beings. When you apply the categorical imperative, you ask what laws you could endorse as a member of this ideal moral community. The pharmaceutical patent dilemma illustrates this principle powerfully. Company executives must ask not merely whether patent violation maximizes welfare or respects property rights, but whether they could endorse universal laws governing intellectual property as members of a community that includes inventors, patients, researchers, and competitors. What laws could rational beings agree upon as simultaneous legislators and subjects? Such reflection might reveal that intellectual property systems serve legitimate moral purposes, protecting the autonomy of inventors, encouraging beneficial research, and maintaining trust necessary for innovation, while also recognizing obligations to ensure access to life-saving treatments. The kingdom of ends perspective suggests seeking solutions that honor both the dignity of inventors and the dignity of those needing treatment, rather than sacrificing either group's interests for aggregate calculations. This approach differs fundamentally from social contract theory, which imagines agreements among rational agents pursuing their separate interests. The kingdom of ends presupposes that rational beings share commitment to moral law itself and seek principles they could endorse from the standpoint of universal reason rather than particular advantage. Consider how this applies to contemporary bioethics. When researchers design experiments involving human subjects, they must ask what protocols they could endorse as members of a moral community that includes both researchers and subjects. This perspective immediately rules out deceptive or coercive research practices, not because subjects might object, but because such practices violate the rational dignity that grounds membership in the moral community. The kingdom of ends also generates positive obligations to promote conditions where rational beings can effectively participate in moral legislation. This includes duties to education, to political institutions that respect human dignity, and to economic arrangements that provide material foundations for rational autonomy. Most importantly, this formulation reveals that moral law aims not merely at preventing wrongdoing but at creating a form of human community worthy of rational beings. When you act according to maxims you could will as universal laws, you contribute to realizing this ideal community in the actual world. The categorical imperative thus serves as more than decision procedure. It provides vision of human relationships based on mutual respect for rational dignity rather than force, manipulation, or calculation of advantage. This moral ideal continues inspiring movements for human rights, democratic governance, and international justice that honor the dignity of rational beings across all boundaries of culture, nationality, and historical circumstance. Chapter 7: Contemporary Applications and Moral Challenges. The categorical imperative's relevance extends far beyond 18th century Königsberg to illuminate moral challenges that define 21st century American life. From artificial intelligence to bioethics, from social media to climate change, contemporary dilemmas require the rigorous moral testing that only the categorical imperative provides. Consider artificial intelligence development. Tech companies face decisions about algorithmic bias, privacy invasion, and autonomous weapons that will shape human civilization. Utilitarian calculations might weigh efficiency gains against potential harms, but the categorical imperative demands more rigorous analysis. Could we rationally will universal laws permitting AI systems to manipulate human behavior without informed consent? Such maxims treat users merely as means to corporate ends, violating human dignity regardless of beneficial consequences. In bioethics, gene editing technologies raise profound questions about human enhancement and equality. Should parents be permitted to genetically modify their children to provide advantages in intelligence, athleticism, or appearance? The universalizability test reveals problems that consequence-based ethics might miss. If genetic enhancement becomes universal practice, natural human diversity diminishes and inequality likely increases as enhancements become available primarily to wealthy families. More fundamentally, treating children as projects to optimize according to parental preferences fails to respect their dignity as rational beings with their own life plans. Social media platforms illustrate how the categorical imperative applies to contemporary communication. Could we rationally will universal laws permitting deliberate spread of misinformation when it serves our purposes? Such maxims undermine the trust and rational discourse necessary for democratic society. Users who share false information must ask whether they could endorse universal adoption of their practice by others. Climate change presents perhaps the most challenging contemporary application. Individual actions like driving, flying, or consuming appear to have negligible impact on global outcomes, yet collectively they threaten human civilization. The categorical imperative cuts through this collective action problem by focusing on maxims rather than consequences. Could you rationally will universal adoption of your consumption patterns? If everyone drove, flew, and consumed at American levels, environmental collapse would accelerate dramatically. Healthcare policy debates gain clarity through categorical imperative analysis. Should medical insurance systems exclude coverage for expensive treatments that benefit few patients? Utilitarian calculations might support such exclusions to maximize overall health outcomes, but the formula of humanity demands respect for each person's dignity regardless of their contribution to aggregate welfare. Healthcare systems must treat patients as ends in themselves, not merely as units in cost-effectiveness calculations. Corporate responsibility illustrates the categorical imperative's practical power. When companies face pressure to maximize shareholder profits versus other stakeholders' interests, universalizability testing provides clear guidance. Could rational beings endorse universal laws permitting corporations to externalize environmental costs onto future generations? Such maxims treat future people merely as means to present profit, violating their dignity as rational beings with legitimate claims to livable environments. Political discourse increasingly suffers from manipulation, demagoguery, and contempt for truth. The categorical imperative requires asking, could we rationally will universal adoption of our rhetorical practices? Politicians and citizens who employ deception, ad hominem attacks, or deliberate misrepresentation must recognize that universal adoption of such practices would destroy the rational discourse necessary for democratic governance. These applications demonstrate why the categorical imperative remains uniquely valuable for contemporary moral reasoning. It provides stable rational foundation for ethics in pluralistic societies where people disagree about religious beliefs, cultural values, and policy priorities. While consequentialist calculations depend on disputed empirical predictions and value weightings, the categorical imperative tests logical consistency of moral reasoning itself. Conclusion. Through this systematic examination, we have discovered why the categorical imperative stands alone as the foundation of genuine morality. Unlike consequentialist ethics that reduce humans to calculation units, religious commands that make morality arbitrary, or social contracts that reflect historical accidents, the categorical imperative tests the logical structure of moral reasoning itself. Its three formulations, universalizability, humanity as end in itself, and kingdom of ends, reveal complementary aspects of a unified rational foundation for ethics. This foundation respects human dignity, generates absolute duties, and creates ideal vision of moral community worthy of rational beings. Most importantly, the categorical imperative provides practical guidance for navigating contemporary moral challenges. Whether facing bioethical dilemmas, environmental responsibilities, technological dangers, or political decisions, you possess a rigorous method for testing moral worth that transcends cultural relativism and utilitarian calculation. The categorical imperative demands much. It requires acting from duty rather than inclination, respecting human dignity even when costly, and maintaining rational consistency in moral reasoning. But this demanding standard reflects the magnificent fact that you possess rational nature capable of moral autonomy. In a world increasingly dominated by consequentialist thinking that treats humans as sophisticated machines for producing outcomes, the categorical imperative reminds us that rational beings possess absolute dignity grounding universal moral law. This insight remains as revolutionary today as when I first articulated it during those crucial years developing critical philosophy. Live according to maxims you could will as universal laws, treat humanity always as an end, and act as a legislating member of the kingdom of ends. These imperatives honor the rational dignity that elevates human existence above mechanical nature.